All right, it looks like the time has come. Let's get started, everybody, with the Lunchtime Discovery Series. Good afternoon, folks. Welcome to today's program. We've got a great show for you today with the Lunchtime Discovery Series. My name is Chris Smith, and I am your host most Wednesdays for this very cool, very interesting lecture program that's brought to you by the North Carolina Office of Environmental Education, who coordinate and organize the program and hosted and broadcasted to you right here as a service of the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, wherein I also work as well. So as always, it's great to be with you. We do have, I think today, a really cool and interesting program. So I'm glad that you're all here, tuned in and ready to go for a great show. Remember that the Lunchtime Discovery Series airs most Wednesdays right here at noon at the museum's YouTube channel. Of course, you can subscribe to the museum's channel right here, click the little bell icon to get notified when we go live, and then you will always be here and be ready when we go live with great programming just like this one. You can also follow the museum on social media at Natural Sciences and the Office of Environmental Education at North Carolina EE. That way you can stay on top of all of the great programs and events just like this one that are happening across both of our institutions. It's definitely worth your time and energy to do so. At least I think so. For today's program, remember as well that it's interactive. So as we go through the presentation and we're learning all kinds of new and exciting things, you're going to have questions. I am sure of it, because you're all very smart and interesting people. Make sure that you drop those questions into the chat box on YouTube or the comments if you're watching on Facebook. That way we can have a great discussion after the slideshow presentation with our guest speaker, where I will pose your questions to today's guest, which I think I should introduce now. That way we can get into all of the fun and great learning that we've got in store for you today. Everybody, I want you to meet Will Reckling. Will is a Ph.D. candidate in the Department of Marine, Earth, and Atmospheric Sciences at NC State University, and Will joins me now. Hi, Will.
Hello, thank you for inviting me today to speak about something that's really exciting to me.
Yeah, I'm excited for today's topic. Drones, it feels like, are in the news all the time. They also seem to be in the skies around me all the time. So I'm excited to see how you're using them.
Yeah, thank you. Well, as I get the screen share to work here, I'll talk about my background a little bit. So I have a background. I've been working in GIS for about 20 years with an initial emphasis on transportation and sewer, water, and electric utilities. And a lot of that has led to the research that I'm going to present today. Give me just 1 second here. Sorry, bear with me for a minute.
Yeah, no worries. While you figure it out too. So you said you spent 20 years in GIS, but that was doing like infrastructure kinds of things? Oh, now I've lost your audio.
I'm sorry about that. Let's try this one more time here. Yeah, so for 20 years, I've worked with different infrastructure projects, and then the past maybe dozen years, I've worked with electric utilities, and that was the basis for a lot of this research.
Okay.
You know, we practice this, and then you know, it all works until it's showtime. So
this is the beauty of making live television, as we say.
Okay. I think we got it here. How's that?
It looks perfect.
Okay. So I'm currently employed as a contractor supporting the Army Corps of Engineers Engineer Research and Development Center at the Geospatial Research Lab. So I work with 3D modeling, and I perform geospatial analysis. I received a master's from NC State, and now I'm a PhD candidate, like you said. And my focus is on environmental research using GIS, remote sensing, 3D modeling, and drones. I'm a licensed FAA Part 107 drone pilot and also a North Carolina professional land surveyor. So I'm going to mention a few terms before we get going with the talk today. So drone, UAS, and UAV are sort of used interchangeably, but they do mean specific things. So a UAS is an unmanned aerial system, and that's the whole thing. That's the software, the pilot, the aircraft, all of those things are the UAS. Where a UAV or a drone typically describe the aircraft itself. So I'll be using drone for most of the conversation, but UAS is more of the technical term, so I might slip back into that. A GIS is a geographic information system, and it's really just a computer system for storing, analyzing, and displaying geographically referenced data. Remote sensing, it's the process of getting information about objects or areas from a distance, and that's usually done from an aircraft or a satellite. LiDAR, it's a remote sensing method that uses light in the form of laser pulses to measure ranges, variable distances to the Earth. A point cloud, it's not always from LiDAR. It can be from imagery too, and it's really just a dense compilation of points, and they represent an X, Y, and Z location at each point location. And then an orthomosaic. So an ortho is an aerial or drone photograph, but it's been altered for topographic relief. It takes out lens distortion and camera tilt, and it makes sort of a measurable photograph, like a map. An orthophoto is a single image, while an orthomosaic is a compilation of those ortho photos. So monitoring environmental change is the focus of government, industry, and research programs. It's important to human health and our natural resources. Most monitoring is done through fieldwork or remote sensing. It comes with high cost and sometimes low resolution. There have been advances in the automation of environmental monitoring efforts. It's necessary to increase their accuracy and cost effectiveness. And in this talk, I'll show how we use geospatial analysis to optimize where we use drones to simplify these workflows for environmental monitoring. In turn, this will improve spatial and temporal understanding, and additionally, it improves safety, saving time and computational resources. So today I'm going to talk about 3 use cases where we're using drones to help with environmental monitoring. So on the surface, you might wonder, what do these topics have in common? The answer is we can monitor them with drones, and that's the focus of the talk today. Our first use case is for rare plant monitoring. So plant monitoring, it can be time consuming, it's dangerous, and it can be imprecise. So people use drones for this kind of work, but the battery life and flight time limit the area that you can fly. And then processing the data that you get back from that is very time and resource intensive. So we developed a machine learning predictive model to create flight areas, which will allow us to focus where we fly the drone for monitoring efforts. And then we use the imagery to identify rare plants. So this whole idea started as a project for a major utility. We were monitoring rare plants for compliance. We're looking for this endangered species, Virginia spirea, in this brush here. But how do we find it there? The traditional way, and well, I was going to try getting the video clearer, but we're just going to leave it be. So the traditional way was to dig around in the thorns. You know, they would send people on the ground to go around in this brush and look for that plant. They thought about using a bucket truck to kind of look over the edge, or maybe a boat in the water to look for the plant. And then someone had the idea and said, hey, what about a drone? And my company we used drones for this kind of work. So we did that. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the U.S. Forest Service people got talking, and they said, well, what about up on this cliff? It's even more dangerous, and it's even more difficult to monitor than along that river valley. Sometimes they even have to rappel down the face of this cliff to look for the plants. So how do we approach this, right? So in order to make a good ortho or a good 3D model, you need to have a flight plan for the drone. But where do you fly, and how do you make the best use of the time and battery? We have to backpack heavy batteries up to this location. Do you just randomly draw an area? I mean, that would work. Do you eyeball it over the edge of the cliff? It would probably also work, but you're not going to make the most efficient use of your battery and time. So we had a better idea. Let's use a machine learning predictive model to plan the flight, and then we'll collect the data and analyze it for plants. So first we create predictors, and then we train the model with plant locations. We perform the predictive modeling, and then we generate flight area polygons, collect the data, find the plants in the imagery. So we tested this methodology up on Roan Mountain in North Carolina with our partners from the Forest Service and Fish and Wildlife Service. Roan Mountain is the second highest peak in North Carolina. It's along the border with Tennessee, and it's a very unique alpine environment. And in this case, we're targeting GM radiatum, or spreading avens, on the right there. So like I said, the first thing we need for the predictive model is to collect and format the predictors. These are species, and that's things like elevation, soils, solar, distance to water, things like that. And then we also need the species locations to train the model with. So that's the training data. And in this case, we use Natural Heritage Program polygons. They're locations of the plants shown there. Once we have that data prepared, we run the Maxent machine learning model. And Maxent is a machine learning species distribution model, and it works very well with limited and presence only data. So just a handful of locations, and then data that says the plant is here, locations of the plants, versus there are some models that require absence data too. So areas that the plant isn't. This one works well with presence only data. And it predicts the probability based on the suitability of conditions. The results of this model become the basis for our flight area. So what we end up from the modeling is a map. So that's on the top left there. And it predicts the probability based on the suitability of conditions. And it also tells us what variables were important to the model solution. And that aligns with what we know about the species. You can see that on the top right there, that table. From there, we can delineate high probability areas. And you can see the white polygon area, or the white line over there. That's 95% probability for GM radiatum. We take that area and we import it into the flight planning software, and that's on the bottom right there. And this is where we set the parameters such as flight altitude, photo overlap, and things like that for the 3D reconstruction. So I've flown this location 4 times now, and from previous experience, shadows were an issue on these cliff faces. So we took high resolution elevation data and we modeled the shadow at that location, and we found the optimal flight time to be 1 p.m. So we collected drone data based on the optimal polygon, and the drone was autonomously flown from the platform up at Roan High Bluff, beginning at about 1 o'clock. We collected nadir, which is downward looking, and oblique, which is sideways looking imagery. The points on the right represent the location of each image we captured during this flight, and you can see it's within that flight polygon area. So at this flight example here, we collected 814 photos, and they were processed to create this point cloud, which contained about 200 million points. And that's a density of about 3,000 points per square meter. The ortho mosaics that we generated had 1.5 centimeter pixel resolution. So the centers of the pixels represented 1.5 centimeters. This provides a very high level of detail, which is sufficient for identifying the GM radiatum plants. They have a unique leaf shape, color, and the bright yellow blooms. A single rosette of the plant measures about 6 centimeters squared, and a patch of rosettes is about 2 meters squared. So this data was very high resolution, and the plants were identifiable in it. So the imagery in orthomosaic was used for digitizing known and then previously unknown GM plants in the GIS. And this picture here kind of shows some of the plants up on that cliff face, and this would be the oblique imagery, the sideways looking imagery. And in this process, we identified 33 known plants in the visual analysis. And we were able to record them at a higher accuracy than the natural heritage program polygons. So you can see those red polygons from before where we trained the model from. You can see that we found some new plants that were outside of this polygon areas in the black dots. 4 new plants were discovered within the probability flight, 95% probability flight area. 3 were located on the cliff face just outside of those polygons. And 1 especially large plant was found outside an area it was outside an area we would typically look for it. In addition to the visual plant ID, we tried a machine learning object detection model. So first we used a tool to label GM radiating plants, and we had 73 photos we'd collected off the internet or taken by ourselves in the field. And what you do is you kind of draw a polygon around the plant, and that's labeling the features in the imagery. And we use another machine learning method to train the model using a neural network framework. We explored the possibility of detecting the GM plants in drone aerial imagery, and then also in photos we'd taken while holding the drone by hand at the study site. And this is me holding the drone at the study site, and this was actually kind of a calibration test, but it worked pretty well for testing the object detection methodology. So here we have the handheld model results from so I was holding the UAS here, and the object detection program was able to identify the plants like in varying light conditions and even amongst heavy like leaf cover by other plants. So you can see the boxes of the detection with the confidence level of the detection, and it also gives you a spreadsheet with similar information. Unfortunately, performing the object detection on the aerial photos didn't work so well in this case. And the reason is, you can see in this picture, the handheld, 1 leaf could be maybe 300 pixels or more. And then in the aerial photos on the right, it might be as little as 10 pixels. So there are efforts to create specific object detectors for this use case that are being developed now. And as a final point, I just want to say that we have a 3D record of this area from each time we do this. So a record from each year, and it's a model that we can measure and monitor from. So like I said, I've thrown this location 4 times now. 1 year was canceled due to COVID, but you can see it. I know it doesn't show up so great in Zoom, but this is us measuring the plants in the 3D model. And for more information, I know this video will be online. You can go to our paper that we published recently in Drones Journal. Okay, so our second use case is to look for leaking septic systems with drones. So leaking or failed systems are a groundwater contamination problem. And a county really only knows about this when they're reported. So and people might say, well, what about using satellites to look for this or whatever? Well, a remote sensing analysis of the entire county is not really cost effective. So we're using a predictive model to identify areas that have a high probability of failure. And then that'll allow us to optimize mapping these locations with the drones. So similar to before, like, let's focus our efforts on the highest probability areas. So this research was conceived as a drone version of a satellite remote sensing project, and it was explored as a partnership between NC State and Wake County. And I probably need to talk about septic systems just for a minute here, because these components matter to the research. So a conventional system consists of a collection line, a septic tank, a distribution system, a drain field, and a repair area. The ones that apply to what we're doing here are the tank lid to the tank and the drain field / distribution system. A septic system malfunction occurs when a system is not correctly treating wastewater, and that leads to environmental and health problems. Failing systems can cause untreated sewage to pond in the yards, and that's a key point there, back up into houses or contaminate water, ground, and surface. Septic system fail due to inappropriate design, overuse, and poor maintenance. So similar to before, we developed a methodology that combines a machine learning technique to create a priority queue for inspection. And then we use drones to map and detect the malfunctions in imagery. So This might sound familiar. We created the predictors, which are the environmental layers. We train the model with known failure locations. We do the predictive modeling with Maxent. And then this is where it differs from the previous effort. We reclassify the results by probability and then area, and I'll discuss that in a minute. And from there, we calculate a proportion of the parcel that has that result, and that creates a priority queue for us. And then we collect the data, identify failures. So this is my last Star Wars reference, but another machine learning method. So we're using Maxent to make a prediction. And what we used was 35 environmental layers as predictors. And that was things like soils, land cover, tree cover, slope. Basically every layer I could find or make that was applicable to septic system malfunctions. This also includes mask layers. So things that it excludes things from the prediction. So we don't want to run this predictive model on parcels that don't have septic systems, or ones that are classified as cemetery or well only. Also, there are regulations about where these systems can be sited. So distance from parcels, distance from house, distance to water bodies, all those things were masked from the model. And then the training data for the model was the malfunction locations. So we had 275 malfunction locations from 2017, and we used that to train the model. So the predictive model resulted in a residential septic system malfunction probability map at a 3-foot resolution. The analysis of the output showed that the number of bathrooms, vegetation cover, land cover, and some of the soil variables were the most important things overall to the model solution. And like the plants, this aligns with what we know about failing systems. So what we have is, if we zoom in on one parcel in particular, we have the prediction on the top left there. And in this case, what we did was we clustered the pixels by 99% probability of a malfunction, or the conditions were suitable for a malfunction, and then areas greater than 280 square meters. And then we found the highest proportion of those pixels per parcel and sorted that in a list. And what it looked like, that's the highest probability parcel right there. And these numbers can be adjusted based on resource availability. So this, based on those two pieces of information right there, it resulted in 102 parcels out of about 390,000 in the county. You know, you could adjust those probabilities lower, the areas lower, and get more if you had the resources to look at all of these possible malfunctions. So for this study, we selected the highest proportion parcel and then 3 parcels that were very close to it. You know, we're going to be in the field already. We might as well hit 3 others while we're out there. The center picture there is zoomed in on that same parcel, but what we do is we buffer the parcel area. So when we create the flight polygon, there's enough imagery coverage over the center of that parcel. And then we import it into the flight planning software on the bottom right. So the images for each study area were processed in orthomosaic. So that's the top 4 images there. And from there, we derived vegetation indices. That's the bottom 4 pictures there. So a vegetation index is a combination of surface reflectance at 2 or more wavelengths. And it's designed to highlight a particular property of vegetation. So many of these indices out there use an inverse relationship between red and near infrared reflectance. But there are several that use RGB, which is important because our drone only flies and collects imagery in the visible spectrum. So red, green, blue. We used green chromatic coordinates, which is abbreviated GCC, because of its successful use in detecting vegetation in a variety of lighting conditions. And it's easily interpreted by the human eye. When you look at the ortho and you see a green area, it shows more green in the index that it generates. So the orthomosaics, the individual photographs and field notes were used at each study site to locate the septic tank lids, which are in the red, in the drone imagery. And then we looked for anomalies adjacent to the tank, such as ponding, strange geometric shapes that probably aren't natural, and excessively green or dead vegetation in the rasters and in the indices. So you can see that black circle there is where the drain field is at this location. You can see some brown vegetation where water had been ponding. or some kind of effluent. 3 sites investigated in our priority queue had indicators of septic malfunction in both the indices and the imagery. The septic field at site 4 was obstructed by heavy tree canopy, and then also a trampoline was right over the middle of it, so we couldn't see under that. We validated the model by researching permits on the Wake County permit portal site, and our search turned up 2 records out of the 4 study sites. One contained a wastewater complaint from 2021 for odor and smell, and it was classified as a surface discharge. The other was from 2020 for sewage backing up into the home. And remember, we ran this on data from 2017. So this was all based on 2017 data, and it identified some parcels that did have malfunctions in 2020 and 2021. All right, and our third use case. So harmful algal blooms can be hazardous to humans and animals. Sampling and monitoring can be disruptive, and it's done from limited locations often. Satellites are used, but they have limited temporal and spatial resolution. So sometimes the revisit times can be a day or 2, and sometimes it's only for the larger water bodies. So you can make drone orthos, but it's very difficult over water because it's hard to match the points over a surface that doesn't have any different features. There has been a trend towards drone sampling. So there have been several groups that have used different methods of sampling water from drones using pumps or things that have grabbers and things like that. But there's still payload and flight time issues. So these kind of rigs are heavy. You want to optimize where you fly. So we've created a rapid way to generate a greenness index from drone imagery, which allows us to survey and locate areas for targeted sampling. So just a little bit about cyanohabs. So blue-green algae, it's more correctly known as cyanobacteria, are frequently found in freshwater systems. They're also found in estuaries and in marine waters in the US. Certain environmental conditions in water bodies can intensify the growth, and that causes a bloom. Blooms that have the potential to harm human health or aquatic ecosystems are referred to as harmful algal blooms, or HABs. Some cyanobacterial HABs, or cyanohabs, can produce toxins, and they can also lower water quality. So you may have heard of them because they've been in the news a lot lately. So these are a few headlines, local headlines from the past month, but it happens every year. And often we don't find out about these things until days after someone or an animal's been exposed, and then often they don't sample until days after the fact. So this started as another utility project. Several large reservoirs in North Carolina are owned or managed by electric utilities. And in this case, our study site is at a reservoir in the western North Carolina mountains. The reservoir is at a hydroelectric generation facility, so there's a dam there, and it has known water quality issues. The work presented in this piece is ongoing still. So right now, when they sample this reservoir, they do it from the dock there. So when I was looking at historical imagery, I found it interesting this dock actually moves. So it's a movable dock. So, you know, we're not getting data from consistent location for one thing. But secondly, if you look at the imagery, there's a lot of green that is not right at that dock. So if you were to sample from this dock on that day, you would miss some of the greenest parts of the reservoir. There are ongoing programs to monitor via satellite. An example would be the EPA NASA Cyan app, but you need at least 900 by 900 square meters. Our reservoir, for example, is only 500 meters across at its widest point. When I looked at this on that app, only 3 pixels covered the reservoir, and that they recommend that that's not a good use case for this tool. So we can try to do it ourselves with available imagery, but you'll see some of the issues. So these are examples from satellites from around our study date, which was October 8th, 2019. So you can see cloud cover in this 3-meter planet satellite imagery. You can see it in the 10-meter Sentinel imagery. Again. We do have a clear day with Landsat, but it's a 30-meter resolution sensor and more cloud. So over the years doing this UAS work, we learned even if it's rainy or forecast to be, you have to go for it. Otherwise, you'll never go. So we stayed in Asheville before we did this flight, and the entire drive up there, it was raining. But once we got up there, it was heavy cloud cover, but it wasn't raining, and we were able to do the flights. And actually, cloudy conditions are ideal because there's no glare or shadows in the imagery. So we collected ground control and checkpoints with a survey grade GNSS receiver or GPS receiver. Ground control there are points that you use to align the model. And you can see this flag here with the GNSS receiver over it. And checkpoints are points that are used to validate the accuracy of the model. So on the right, we used a Paradenofi thermal drone. And we'll talk more about this sampling rig later. So we start with a flight plan, which autonomously controls the drone. Green is the flight line, and red is the photo locations. And unlike the other two examples, this area was hand-drawn in the field. We performed 2 RGB flights and 1 thermal, and then 2 sampling flights. When we got back to the office and tried to align the photos to make the 3D model and the ortho photos, you can see that the software is unable to match enough points over the water surface. And this is a well-documented problem over water, snow, wheat fields, things like that. You need to have a lot of shore or identifiable things for the software to be able to match the points. This is a tilted 3D view of the software. It shows the photo footprints and their orientation. And you can see that it missed about half of the photos missed alignment, so the red areas there. So it appears to make an ortho, at least a partial one. So this covers about half of the flight area. This problem gets worse at the coast where there's not even this much shore around the water body. So again, it's an ortho, but it's not a great one. If we zoom in and look, this is just one example in this ortho alone. You can see there's repeating swirls. So the software repeated swirls in it. And a double island. That actually is not the way that this land feature looks here. So that triangle on the bottom, that number 3 is a ground control point location. And that entire peninsula above it is probably in the wrong spot. So we have a solution. So let's take the photos. Let's take the XY coordinates of each photo, which are recorded by the drone, and sample the pixels directly beneath the drone in the photography. And what that looks like is this. So if we zoom in on one of these harmful algal blooms, this is actually what this image is of. And we take 25 cells, 9 cells, or 1 cell directly from the drone and average those. We can interpolate a surface. So interpolation is the process of creating a continuous or prediction surface from sampled point values. And you may be familiar with this from meteorology. So, rain or temperature maps are interpolations of values at locations. The point values here are from the images, and they're converted to a greenness index, just like we talked about before. And here are 2 different times a day at the reservoir, before lunch and after lunch, a couple hours apart. I put this in here just to show what the thermal imagery looks like from the UAS. We didn't use it in this project, but it is available with the platform we were flying. So let's talk about the sampling. So to collect samples, we suspended a bottle from the drone. We dip it in the water using the controller, either a lat long or and the video feed. We know how long the line is, so we can use the altitude in the flight controller, and we dip it in the water. And it's somewhat a tricky process. The line length and the load affect the aircraft performance. The drone it sways on turns, it sways in the wind, and it's really hard on the motors. And the wind over the water and along the cliffs can be pretty intense. So the bottle's flown back to where we are, and while the drone's hovering, we remove it from the bracket, cap it, and put it in a cooler to go back to the lab. For some of the sites, we filtered the water in the field. So you can see a manifold for filtering the water. So you pour the water into this plastic containers there, and it filters it on a fiberglass filters. And you can see that on the right there. That's some of the biomass that's collected in that water. And for this reservoir, from the collected samples, it was possible to interrogate them using a light microscope And the result of that quick assessment was microcystis-like cells. That is a toxin-producing genus. It's a cyanohab species. So microcystin, the toxin, was detected in these samples. Ultimately, we intend to compare the lab values to the imagery values, the interpolation values. And the goal will be to fly a site, make that interpolation, and sample according to that interpolation. It'll help direct us to where we need to go. And then a little note about the hardware. So we noticed something from our early sample rig design, the very thing we were trying to avoid, which is surface disruptance, disrupting the surface. So this hole in the middle here is from the prop wash. So the propellers of the drone blew out a circle there. The initial line was less than 10 feet. It was a clear monofilament fishing line, and that's on the left there, and a 3D printed bracket that held 150 milliliter tubes. That's the left picture. I found that line to be prone to tangling when you were done doing the sampling, and also we had some issues with being swept into the propellers. So we ended up using a 20-foot bright green braided fishing line on the right there, and we put carabiners on the top and bottom of that line so we could quickly attach and detach it from the drone. So here are a couple different sampling bracket designs we tried. So the left is the first one. It's a 3D printed bracket that held 150 milliliter tube. We wanted more volume, so we fabricated an aluminum 2-bottle bracket. But as soon as that aluminum hit the water with those plastic bottles, it flipped over and you were collecting air. So that didn't work very well. We tried a rubber band. I know it's not very glamorous, but it's cheap and easy. It worked fine for one tube, not so great for two, but it was kind of a nuisance with algae because the band would snap and like splash water on you. Ultimately, we ended up with one that's cheap and easy to make. So it's a fabric mesh. We cut it with scissors. It sinks in the water. The tubes slide in and out. It's very cheap. I think we calculated it costs less than 10 cents each to make these. And we have some fishing gear on it to attach it to the carabiner there. We evaluated several different collection bottles. So we wanted as much water as possible without affecting the drone too much because, again, the battery time diminishes with increased volume, and also it handles worse with heavier loads. We came back with that 1 liter bottle. The motors were like incredibly hot. We tried a sippy cup and several other tubes. We landed on that 50 millimeter Falcon tube on the bottom left, 2 of those. And it seemed that conical design, that like cone at the bottom, facilitated it tipping into the water just right. So the research presented here provides a data-driven approach to plan flight areas or to target sampling, which improves imagery and sample collection. This helps with environmental monitoring, saving resource, time, and funds. And I'll even add that it improves personnel safety. And I'd like to thank some of our partners involved in this effort. Thank you.
Will, thank you. Really interesting presentation. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you.
So let me remind all the viewers, now that we've got to the end, drop questions about today's topic, drones and research, in the chat. I'm going to be looking to all of you for your thoughts and questions here in just a moment. But Will, it occurs to me that being a drone pilot, working out in these kind of wild places, there must be some like very specific challenges to operating drones and to following a scientific methodology that are just inherently challenging. What maybe were some of those?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. We plan a lot for these different efforts, and when you get out there, it seems that every time something goes awry. Up at Roan Mountain, a couple times you get up there and the drone's just misbehaving, like it's not getting a GPS fix or something like that. Additionally, up on Roan Mountain, the winds coming up that cliff face are very, very, like maybe 30 or 40 mile per hour winds, and you're flying at 5,000 feet already. It's kind of nerve wracking. And it's a similar case for the coast. The winds can be very intense out at the coast too.
Yeah, I've been fortunate working here at the museum. Like, we have a drone pilot on staff here at the museum. So shooting like promotional stuff. And he's also had the opportunity to go and do some scientific research around the world, actually, with some of our researchers. And he's talked about some of the same kinds of issues, like just getting it connected to the satellite, or just getting it up in the air sometimes, and trying to figure out how to get the right angle on the photos. Like, it's really hard. Like I have a neighbor who loves to go out and fly a drone around the neighborhood. It's not that easy when you're trying to use it for science.
Right. I prefer to let the flight controller handle the drone flying, but that's not always the way it works, and it's even more nerve-wracking when you're flying it with your own hands. So
yeah,
yes.
I can only imagine. I can only imagine. But then thinking about like bringing all of the data together, what kind of a time commitment is it just to get the like geospatial layers brought? Like you said, you had like 35, 40 individual layers, and that's a lot of data to have to work with.
Yeah, so for processing the Roan Mountain, the predictive layer, the predictors for that probably took a couple months to prepare the data for that model. That was for the whole Blue Ridge ecoregion, so that's a unique region. I prepared data for the entire state of North Carolina. So given any plant species, we could go anywhere in North Carolina and do a similar approach. So that was the idea there. But that took months and months to prepare the data. And then that Wake County data at that resolution also took months and months to prepare.
And are the layers, like you have that 1.5 centimeter resolution, is that are those from like private satellite companies? How do you find data with that great of a resolution?
Well, that resolution was from the drone data. So that was the orthophoto I generated from the drone. And then the elevation data, I think, was 3-foot elevation data from the flood mapping program in North Carolina.
All right, got you. I understand a little bit more. I don't have 20 plus years in GIS, but I think I took a class on it in college once, and so a lot of trying to like access that part of my brain to really dig in here. But you just said you did the plant layers, the plant data, and that could be for any plant across the entire state.
That was the idea. So NHP maintains the database for all rare and endangered species in North Carolina. So given any species, we could run that methodology and plan some optimal flight areas for that species. That was the idea.
That the Natural Heritage Program or Fish and Wildlife are planning to kind of like jump in and think about how to do some of that?
That's a good question, and I think those conversations are ongoing.
So let me throw a question at you from our chat. Jeff is wondering whether drones might also be used for real-time assessments for species. An example would be looking for rattlesnakes on rock outcrops too difficult to access.
Yeah, I think you could do that in the video